Hello, Robert, how are you?
Boa tarde. Muito bom.
Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes, como se diría en España.
Buenas tardes. Muy bien. ¿Cómo están ustedes?
Muy bien,
José?
¿usted?
Bien, gracias.
I'm very happy after Biden's victory. I'm very, very happy.
Well, we may restore a little bit of sanity and rationality to our country.
Yes.
But
yes.
the forces of reaction are too strong. And the fact that 70 million people would vote for Trump, this is very alarming. However, 80 million voted for Biden, so that's good.
Yes.
Yes.
And what do you think about the choice of Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary?
It's good. I mean, you know, we will see. But I mean, she's very distinguished, capable, smart. I did not think she would be interested in doing this. So it's really a very high prestige appointment. But
yes, I like it. I like very much the
I think in general, yes. But what we have to see is, will the Trump administration pursue fiscal stimulus or pursue austerity? This is going to be the big debate here, as it has been in Brazil and Europe and so many other countries.
Yeah.
Mike, you got in.
Yes.
Yeah, we just sent you an email. We had a little trouble with the link, but I used the meeting ID and the password, and then that worked.
Me as well. Yeah, I figured that out. It took me a minute, but
I just got the.
So I'm going to test Daniela.
Yes.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Hello, nice to meet you, Robert. We are already live on Facebook, just warning you.
Okay. I'm going to test the share screen function just to make sure it works.
I will stop here.
It says that host has disabled this. So if you are the host,
yes,
a hostess, you need to enable it.
I think it's fine now.
Okay, let's test that hypothesis. Yes, it's working.
Hello, Kim.
But I need to find the right, this one. Yes, and then I would.
Yes, it's working.
Screen.
We are seeing.
You can see it. You can see
yes.
it. Okay. But I will stop it now. Well, let's test something else. Can Yun or Mike just share over that? Or you need to give them authority too? Or
no,
just...
yes, no, they are allowed to share.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me try, because I'm the first one who's gonna start. Maybe I should try to see whether I can share my.
See if you can share it while my share is still there. If not, I'll take it down. But there is an option for that. I don't know if it's set or not.
Okay, hold on. Let me see. Share the screen. I think I can. You're looking at my slide.
I have to stop it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now
Daniela, the meeting will be recorded, isn't it?
Sorry?
Daniela, a reunião vai ser gravada, não vai?
Yes, I will start.
All right.
Right.
So we'll record the webinar, and well, it's now recording. So we have 7 minutes to the schedule time, so we can talk a little bit of anything that you want.
So to let you know, as Yun said, Yun will begin, he will start, and then I will cover the middle part, and Mike will do the last part. So that's the order we will go in.
Right.
Okay.
when we start the webinar, Daniela will present you guys. Then I will speak 1 or 2 minutes, and then you can start. I believe that each one of you are in different parts of the United States, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm in Boston. Yes.
Michael, where are you?
So I live in Maine, but I am currently in Baltimore, Maryland for the holidays. So.
All right.
And I am actually in Chevy Chase, Maryland, right outside Washington. So Mike and I at least are in the same state.
Yes.
What about you guys?
Yesterday was the Thanksgiving Day in the United States, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very
It's always
unusual.
on the same day. There is a fixed date for the Thanksgiving.
The third Thursday.
The fourth Thursday in November.
Yeah.
Fourth. All right. Right. Fourth Thursday of November. Okay. And what's the origin of the commemoration? Because I think that there is only in the United States that you have a Thanksgiving Day.
Canada has a Thanksgiving holiday too, but it's earlier. It's in October. The origin, well, the modern celebration goes back to around the time of Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, 1860s. But the mythological origin is with some of the first English settlers, the Pilgrims, who came to what is now Massachusetts at the area of Plymouth Rock in 1620, exactly 400 years ago. And supposedly they had a dinner to celebrate their harvest or just being alive. And the native peoples, the so-called Indians, joined with them and they had a nice feast together. And no one knows if this is true or not, but it's a very nice myth. Probably they ate fish. If they had a dinner, they would eat fish and squash, and maybe deer, venado. But in modern celebration, the typical main dish is turkey, roast turkey.
Yes, I know
pavo. And but this year it was very unusual. Many of us were in very small groups and doing Zoom like this with our families. But better than nothing.
Yeah, yes.
And we are glad to have our health and be safe.
Another party that I think that
Robert.
exists. Hi.
Bonjour or bonsoir or whatever time
Bonsoir,
it is.
Bonsoir, it's time for dinner. I will have dinner while listening to you, right?
Bon appetit.
Thanks a lot.
But I think that another party that only exists in the United States is the Halloween, isn't it?
Well, it derives from a tradition that exists in other countries. So because it's All Hallows Eve, the day before All Hallows Day. And so, for example, in Mexico, they celebrate the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos.
Yes, in Brazil, yes, we did. You celebrate the Day of Death, which is in November 2.
So
in Spain,
they're related. They are related.
People celebrated November 1st as the All Saints Day, but the Halloween is basically an American tradition, I think.
Yes, we have evolved it in a unique way. Well, I don't
It's
know.
not really holiday though.
Pardon?
It's not really holiday though.
Yeah, we have to go to work and school.
Yeah, it's not really holiday.
All right.
Well, it's a holiday for the children. They go out at night and get candy.
All right, I understand now. All right, it's not a holiday. All right, it's only for children and.
Yeah.
All right.
Like a party, younger adults go out and have a party. So, yeah.
But in many workplaces, not much work is actually done on that day. It depends on the type of occupation.
Yeah.
It's 4 o'clock if you want to start.
Yes, I think that we can start. It's 4 o'clock, so Daniela, please make the official start.
Let's start. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm Daniela Freddo, Professor of Economics at University of Brasilia. It's an honor to be here today as chair of this webinar about the system estimation of a structural model of distribution and demand in the US economy. This was an initiative of the Structuralist Macroeconomics Research Group led by Professor Oreiro. Representing the area of political economy of our postgraduate program in economics at the University of Brasilia, I would like to welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation, our speakers, Professor Robert Blecker, Professor Y.K. Kim, and Professor Michael Cavell. Robert Blecker is a professor of economics at American University, Washington, D.C., and a fellow of the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policy. His newest book is Heterodox Macroeconomics, Models of Demand, Distribution, and Growth. His research includes work on post-Keynesian models of open economies, international trade theory and policy, and economic integration in North America. Y.K. Kim is an associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts of Boston. His recent research is mostly about the macroeconomic implications of households' debt accumulation. Michael Cavell is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Southern Maine. He is a post-Keynesian economist whose research focuses primarily on the relationship between income inequality and macroeconomic performance. Each speaker will have around 15 to 20 minutes for making his presentation. Afterwards, Professor Oreiro will make some considerations, and then we will open for questions from the public. Now, thanks for everybody who is watching this webinar. Now I will leave Professor Oreiro to welcome our guests.
Well, good afternoon for people in America, south or north, and good night for people in Europe. And well, maybe good morning for people in Asia. I see Giulio Guarini. I see my Gabriel Porcilli. It's Professor Ignacio from Mexico.
From Mexico.
And well, it's a pleasure to see you on this second international webinar of the Structuralist Macroeconomics Development Research Group, co-organized with the graduate program in political economy of the University of Brasilia. Today, we have the pleasure to hear the presentation of Robert Blecker and Michael Cavell, and you were Kim, and about the term that is very important in post-Keynesian literature is the debate between wage-led and profit-led demand and growth regimes. This debate begins in the beginning of the 90s with the seminal paper of Magdalene Baduri that started a long controversy in post-Keynesian economics, maybe causing almost a split of the school between two sides, the profit leaders and the wage leaders. So, but I think that the lecture that we have today can clarify some theoretical and empirical issues on this debate. So please, gentlemen, the audience is yours.
Okay, so I think I'm the first one to start. Let me make my view full screen mode. and then go from there. So yeah, well, thank you for having us. We are very glad that I know that Robert let us know about this seminar, and this is a great opportunity to interact with the colleagues in other places. So this is great, and thank you again for having us. So the title of the paper is System Estimation of the Structural Model of Distribution and Demand in the US Economy. So I'm gonna start with the stylized fact. We are focusing on US case. So this is the US wage share, 3 different measures between 1960s and 2017. It's very clear that all three, so we have this total economy wage share, non-farm business sector, non-financial corporations. As you can see that there is a very sharp decline since 2000 for all three measures. And since 1970s, and it's 2 of them, total economy and non-farm business sector, shows that long-term downward trend of the wage share. So this is the US case, but we all know that this is the case for many other countries. There has been a serious discussion about what has been the cause of these rising inequalities. Whether you are looking at the functional income distribution or personal income distribution, you seem to get a rising inequalities many places. And what is the consequence of these rising income inequalities? Has reduction in the labor share has anything to do with this stagnation tendency that we seem to observe in many countries, including US? And if so, what should be the right policy to address these problems? Should we think about these labor market policies, antitrust policies that limit the monopoly powers? Would that help to restore more equitable distribution and the sustainable growth and demand? Those are the kind of the things that many of us think about, right? And more specifically, there has been a very serious empirical research and theoretical research in our traditions try to really understand the relationship between distribution and demand. In the literature, of course, it's known as a wage-led and profit-led demand and growth. Now, so I think the Blecker's 2016 papers summarize this very well, very clearly. It's a great reference point. So that you understand the relationship between distribution and demand. In the literature, of course, it's known as a wage-led and profit-led demand and growth. I didn't quite get that. I'm sorry. That could you repeat? Was it the questions? Could you repeat your questions or comments, please?
I think everyone should make sure that they are muted so that we don't hear random sounds. Thank you.
I don't think it was a random sound. I thought it was a question or comment by audience. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. I
think that it's better for any questions from audience to be made at the end of the presentations, and after the authors end of the presentation, I will do my comments, and then I will open for the audience for anyone who wants to make a question to make for them. I think that will be a more rational way for conducting this webinar. Please continue, Kin.
Okay, so we'll do so then. Okay, so I was talking about I was just talking about that in the heterodox traditions, macro traditions. There has been some serious research on this distribution and demand, or more known names are this wage-led demand and growth or profit-led demand and growth. And the Blecker's 2016 paper really talks about this very clearly. And he distinguished 2 different approaches. One approach is more of what he labels as aggregative studies. It's more of those economy-wide model, system model, multi-equations that try to estimate whether economy is more profit-led or wage-led, system-wide. Most often you see VAR model in these studies. And what we see, according to the classifications, those aggregative studies tend to indicate that many economies are profit-led, majority of economies, except some few studies, as we pointed out in these slides. Now there is another branch of that research strand that what Robert labels as structural studies. I think it's more popular in Europe, especially in England, where they estimate the individual equations, individual demand component, and try to calculate the overall impact, overall effect, overall magnitude. They tended to find that economies, especially the large economies like US, EU, Germany's, they tended to be more wage-led, except some countries that smaller or more open economies. They tended to find that those few economies, they find that they are more of the profit-led. So we build upon these distinctions and try to understand where the difference comes from in terms of the result. And so that we build our own system GMM model and compare that with, I think we think it's very well thought, model of the structural studies, individual equation of the individual demand component. We try to compare them and see this structural approach in general, those approach that estimating individual equations in general suffer from a simultaneity bias in the US case. We focus on the US here. So, okay. So I'm gonna briefly review the result that we have. Surprisingly, we find that estimating the separate single equation of that approach, what Robert labels as a structural approach, tend to underestimate the wage-led demand effect. In other words, our system GMM approach, the result out of that tended to show that US case is a more wage-led, or at least is less profit-led compared to this OLS estimates of the separate equations following structural approaches. And I think these are the two important points here. We are trying to be faithful to the theoretical model that tells us the different distributional shift, the source of the distributional shift matters for the overall result. And we're gonna talk about this more later on, but we find that we find consistently wage-led demand for the shocks to the monopoly power, but even bigger effect, larger effect with the GMM systems. And we also find that interestingly, the mixed result for the shocks to the unilever cost, largely I think we think it's because there seems to be some kind of structural break around the 1982. So those are the preview of the result. We like to highlight that our results are more about Shonan. And obviously, as I said, focus is only for the US case. Okay. Now, literature review part, I'm not gonna talk too much about it. The general ideas, I already talked about general ideas, right? So, and as I said, so structural approach emphasizes the single equation estimations of this each demand component. They tend to find more of the wage-led result. Few exceptions, but especially the big countries, more of the wage-led result. They treat income variables like distributive shares and total GDP as extraneous. In other words, they put them in the regressor as a regressors in the individual estimating equations. And obviously, there are some studies that point out limit or so yeah, some limits of the structural approaches, some criticism of the structural approaches. So first, I think many people pointed out that wage and profit share should not be treated as extraneous, should be endogenous variables. And a single equation approach, estimating approach, ignores common shock, but also misses indirect distributional effects because it misses multiplier and accelerator type kind of effect, the channels, the mechanisms. And I think it's not just about the structural studies, it's also a case for the aggregate studies, but we believe in general, literature do not distinguish between residential and non-residential investment, which is important, right? Because kind of the variables that matters for the residential investment and non-residential investment must be quite different. And that means that the change of the distribution should have a different effect on the whether the different effect on residential and non-residential investment. So so this is a criticisms, and as theory points out, starting from the Blecker 1989 papers, theory points out that kind of a result that we observe, whether economy is wage-led or demand-led, or whether the wage-led effect is more pronounced or profit-led effect is more pronounced, should depend on source of the distributional shift. But however, many studies, most of the studies, as far as we know, ignores this, yeah. And especially the structural studies. So naturally, our studies try to address these limits, the limitations, these criticisms. This is in our knowledge, first paper, research paper to estimate structural model of aggregate demand that use system GMM to control simultaneity and common shocks. So they naturally incorporate this multiply and accelerate type the mechanisms naturally. It's more theoretically grounded, our specifications. Obviously, because we are using the system method, we can naturally endogenize the wage share and union labor cost. And we clearly distinguish between residential and non-residential investment. And we are again faithful to theoretical models emphasizing that different types, different sources of the distributional shocks, different types of the distributional shocks matters, and that effect should be sorted differently. And then we are faithful to that theoretical predictions. So our models try to address this, incorporate these ideas all together. And it's very theoretical. We believe that it's more theoretically grounded empirical model than most of others that we are aware of. More specifically, our more empirical econometric model is more consistent with these neoclassical models for the open economies, which was developed, especially, starting from basically Blecker's 1989 paper, the seminal paper that talks about this profit-led and wage-led effect, incorporating this open economy dimensions, right? And so our model has this endogenous wage share, incorporating the markup, being sensitive to competitive pressures. So again, it's well theoretically grounded. And again, different causes of the change in distribution can have a different effect on output, and our model will be able to capture that clearly. Okay. So from now on, I think the Robert is going to take over and talk about that, the theoretical part.
Yun, maybe you could take down your share and then I'll share my screen. Is that okay? Yes. So first of all, hello everyone. It's good to see so many friends and colleagues from around the world. And I would like to join Yon in thanking Jose and Daniela for this kind invitation. And in spite of the pandemic, we are all finding ways to maintain our connections and our interchange of ideas. And this is really fabulous. But without further ado, I will endeavor to continue the presentation. If I find the right button. There. So is everybody seeing the presentation once again? But I am in the wrong place. Okay, so as Yun said, we tried to make the empirical or econometric model in this paper more consistent with the theories of Neo-Kaletskian models for open economies. The theory in this paper, therefore, the model in this paper is not really new theory. It is simply an effort to take the existing theoretical models and formulate them in a way that is convenient for econometric estimation. And I should also say very clearly that our work in this paper is entirely within the structural approach, or I prefer to call it multi-equations, and that we do not address the aggregative approach in this paper. So many of these equations will be very familiar to all of you, or most of you, if you have read this literature. There is an assumption of an oligopolistic market structure with excess capacity. Prices are set by a markup tau on unit labor costs, which are the ratio of the nominal wage to labor productivity. And we also use ULC to indicate unit labor cost. And it's well known in this case, the profit share is simply an increasing function of the profit share pi is an increasing function of the markup tau, and the wage share is inversely related to the markup tau. Well, that was fast. Now for the part that I think has been missing from the empirical studies, this is our specification of the flexible markup in an open economy. So the idea is that the markup factor 1 plus tau varies not only with the monopoly power of the firms, how oligopolistic are the industries, which is in this term mu, but also with the external competitiveness of the home country products relative to other countries. So we express that, by the real exchange rate. This is measured the Latin American way as the real value of foreign goods. So a higher real exchange rate is a real depreciation. And that is raised to a power theta, which can be either greater than or equal to 0. So if theta is positive, then if there's a real depreciation, home country firms can raise their markups as they're sort of relieved from competitive pressures. But if there's an appreciation, a fall in the real exchange rate, then they would have to squeeze their profit markups. And this has been demonstrated in a very large literature going back to the 1980s. However, it is possible, and you will see that this relates to some of our empirical results, that theta could equal 0. And that would be more like a closed economy setting in which the markup would depend only on the domestic degree of monopoly and not on external competition. And that would be more similar to the closed economy Neo-Kaletskian models. But I'll save that until we get to the empirical part. Now also, we write the real exchange rate as the product of Z or Z. It depends on where you learned your English as to whether this letter is Z or Z. And Psi, which is my best effort at pronouncing that Greek letter. Psi is the wage share, which we define back here, simply 1 minus the profit share. Z, I'll use the British since this is an international conversation. Z is a variable that we consider an index of home country competitiveness. So it is the ratio of foreign goods prices converted to domestic currency to domestic unit labor costs. And the higher is Z, the more expensive are foreign goods, and therefore the more competitive are the home country products. And if we use that definition for Z, we can easily show that the wage share C must equal this expression down here, where mu and Z are both raised to powers that are negative. So the wage share is inversely related to the monopoly power of firms, mu, and to this cost competitiveness variable, Z. Then turning to the national income accounts, we look at them from both the aggregate demand side and the national income side. On the aggregate demand side, as Yun said, we decompose investment into residential and non-residential, or in more common terms, housing and business investment, plus government plus exports minus imports. Although we do not consider government spending in this paper, we consider it to be exogenous. And then on the income side, national income is decomposed into wages, or by which we really mean total labor income, and profits, or total capital income. And I don't think I need to belabor this very much. So then we specify equations for the components of aggregate demand. Now, this is what distinguishes the structural approach. So we have here a consumption function, a non-residential investment function, and a residential investment function. And without going into the details, they're each a function of some indicator of income distribution. For consumption, we use the wage, total wages, and total profits separately. And then there can be some control variables, the alpha and the A, or simply think of that as vectors of coefficients and indicators of control variables. And for the two kinds of investment, we use the same functional form, but with a different economic interpretation. So they each have an accelerator effect. As output grows, we expect more investment, but they're also functions of the wage share, representing income distribution and exogenous factors, with the difference that we expect the coefficient here on in the non-residential equation to be negative. So this would be the Margolin-Baduri's idea that the investment responds negatively to the wage share or positively to the profit share. But we expect the wage share effect to be positive in the equation for residential investments, as workers buy the vast majority of housing. By the way, all the equations are in log differences. This was for econometric reasons, essentially to have stationarity and to avoid heteroskedasticity and all those usual econometric reasons. That means that these coefficients, the gammas with the subscripts, are all elasticities. Now, again, the more innovative part here is the way we do exports and imports. So first we write standard functions for demand for exports and imports. For those of you who do Thorwald type models of balance of payments, constrained growth, these would be the same kind of equations you would use in those models. But then we make some substitutions, because the change in the real exchange rate, which is the relative price effect, we want to turn it into a function of Z, our cost competitiveness ratio, and mu, the degree of monopoly. And we also, by using that equation I showed you earlier, we just take differences in logs, we can express the wage share, the change, the log difference in the wage share as a negative function of both the degree of monopoly, mu, and the cost competitiveness, Z. So then these are the equations we actually end up estimating for the latter set of variables. So for exports, the price elasticity epsilon x is multiplied by this expression, where you see separate effects of Z, cost competitiveness, and mu, degree of monopoly. And we do the same thing in the import equation. And then, of course, we have standard income effects with income elasticities. In the equation for the wage share, we found that we got very poor fits and had econometric difficulties using the log change in Z. So instead, we decompose Z into its components, which you will recall are foreign prices converted to domestic currency, E times PF, and unit labor costs. So this is the equation we estimated for the wage share, along with control variables that are not shown here. So now let me just very briefly summarize how we did the econometric estimation. We have a lot of details in extra slides here that we can show you if there are questions at the end, but I will try to keep this brief. So there were 7 equations in the system for 5 components of aggregate demand: consumption, the 2 kinds of investment, exports and imports, and then 2 distributional variables, which are also treated as endogenous: the wage share C and unit labor costs. Initially, we estimated each equation as autoregressive distributed lag, ARDL, of 1 and 2, meaning 1 lag of the dependent variable, 2 lags of the independent variables, in OLS, ordinary least squares, using the Schwartz criterion to select lag lengths. But then we made adjustments to the equations for several reasons. First, to satisfy diagnostic tests, for example, no serial correlation of the residuals, no heteroscedasticity, etc. Also, to satisfy the reset test, Ramsey's reset test for equation this specification. For the GMM estimation, we had to limit the number of parameters, and so that required us to take out some variables that were either insignificant or we found we could still get good estimates without them. And lastly, we made some adjustments to improve the fit with theory. So for example, if the wage share turns out to be insignificant in the equation for investment, but we think theoretically it should be there, then we left it in just so that we can have a result. It may still be insignificant, but we leave it there so you can see that result. Another complication is a structural shift in the variable unit labor cost measured in log differences, which resulted in a structural break in the coefficient on that variable in the equation for the wage share. So as you can see, this diagram is showing the rate of change, log difference in unit labor costs. We have, again, the 3 different measures, like Yun said, for 3 different ways, kind of aggregate for the total economy, the non-farm or non-agricultural business sector, and non-financial corporations. Their behavior is very similar, as you see. And you can see that there is a very significant break around 1982. In econometric terms, I think we could say this is a change in the data generating process. Before 1982, there's a higher mean. Remember, this is the percentage change. This is the log difference. There's a higher mean and even somewhat of an indication of a rising tendency of the rate of increase, but then a constant mean at a much lower level and less volatility after 1982. And this seems to be associated, with major changes in the U.S. economy, the advent of neoliberal policies under Ronald Reagan, weakening of labor unions, globalization, financialization, many, many institutional and structural changes. But the result of that is that when we put this variable into the equation for the wage share, we need a structural break, and that will influence the results, as Mike will explain. Now there's, most of our variables are very standard macro variables. You can download them from the standard websites. It's all in an appendix to the paper. But one variable has not been included in these studies before because it's very hard to measure. And that's the degree of monopoly, the theoretical degree of monopoly from Koletsky. And there is no perfect measure of this. We're quite aware that our efforts are imperfect, but we use 2 alternative proxies, and I emphasize that they are proxies. There is no perfect measure. So one is more of an accounting measure and one is more of a kind of theoretical measure, actually a very neoclassical measure, but that's okay. So in what we call model one, our proxy for mu is what we call the gross profit margin. It is the ratio of profits per unit to unit labor costs in the non-financial corporate sector. So to explain, our estimates are for the whole economy. So here what we're doing is we're taking a very crude and simple measure of the gross profit margin in the non-financial businesses, which are the core of the business sector, and using that as a proxy for the degree of monopoly in the economy as a whole. The second model uses an estimate in a paper by Blecker, Eichhout, and Unger, that just published this year, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, an excellent paper, which estimated average markup rates over marginal costs using a methodology that tries to identify that the marginal costs at a micro level, then back out the markups. And the point of that methodology is to find the part of the markup that is accounted for or explained by monopoly power of firms. And so we have these two alternative measures or proxies for the degree of monopoly. We know they're both imperfect. And I do want to qualify that they are not instruments, because we understand that they can also be endogenous variables. So their lags are used as instruments like for other variables, but the contemporaneous values of these two indicators are treated as endogenous because they can be affected by what's going on in the economy. That brings me to variables and instruments. So in the GMM estimation, of course, we treat all of the basic variables as endogenous, all the components of private demand, all of the income and distributional variables, because in the single equation estimates, it's not only the wage share that's endogenous, also total GDP or total wages or total profits. These are all endogenous variables. So every measure of income or components of income or income shares and unit labor costs, they're all endogenous. Furthermore, even some of our control variables in those equations are endogenous. Things like the increase in debt in a sector. Well, the increase in debt, the contemporaneous value is affected by, let's say, the level of consumption spending or investment spending. So that's endogenous. But we have some control variables that are treated as exogenous. And then, of course, we use lags of all the variables as much as possible econometrically as instruments. And we use up to 4 additional lags of some variables as instruments, but we were limited in this by the degrees of freedom in the GMM system. So we had to constrain the number of lags. And we have lots of details and extra slides, but I will not show those here. One more slide, and then I will turn this over to Mike. So as Yun emphasized, in this paper, we consider different underlying determinants of income distribution. And in this model, those two exogenous factors, or at least those two explanatory factors, maybe not exogenous, are the degree of monopoly mu, which we actually do take as exogenous, and unit labor costs representing labor bargaining. By the way, these are nominal unit labor costs. And here we follow the previous literature on structural models or so-called single equation models. We add up the marginal effects of shocks to these variables on the components of aggregate demand. So what's different from the previous literature is that, first of all, we look at these two different sources of shocks. We do not consider changes in the wage share as a shock, but rather we look at shocks that affect the wage share and also affect the components of GDP and total GDP. And the second difference, of course, is that we use systems estimation with general method of moments. But what we do that is similar, and this is really for purposes of comparison, is to add up the marginal effects of the wage share on the components of GDP. as has been done in the previous studies. Now, this methodology is controversial. As Jon indicated previously, there are important criticisms of this methodology. I think some of the people who have written those criticisms are actually sitting in here today. And we are well aware that this methodology does not capture all of the dynamic interactions between the variables. And so we want to emphasize the limited purpose of what we're doing here. We're trying to make our estimates as comparable as possible with the previous literature in this branch of the literature, the previous structural studies, so that we can test for the direction of bias in the OLS estimates. So when we estimate the equations separately by OLS, is that biasing the results toward more wage-led findings? Because this has been suggested as a reason why the structural models find more wage-led results, and yet the aggregative studies find more profit-led results. And so this adding up method, while it has its problems, allows us to look at that direction of bias in a way that is, I think, will contrast nicely with the previous literature. And with that, I will stop my sharing and turn the floor over to Mike, who will walk you through the results.
Thank you, Robert. And I would like to echo the thanks that my co-authors have given as well for extending the invitation to us and for everyone else who joined to listen to us discuss our paper. So I'm going to be discussing the results. If it will let me advance my slides. Okay, great. So I'm not going to spend too much time on all of these equations, but needless to say that the methodology that we use to estimate the model reflects back on the theoretical model that Robert was discussing. So essentially what we do is we estimate coefficients for each of these separate equations that we estimate, consumption and the other various components of private aggregate demand. And then we add up all of the marginal effects for each of those equations at the end. And we do have two separate sets of models because we do use those two different measures or proxies for the target markup. And so actually we end up with 4 different sets of results that we want to compare because we have these two different models based on these two different measures. And then for each of those models, we have results in OLS, which is what we view as being consistent with previous models in this literature. And then we estimate that same model using systems GMM to try and see or isolate that effect of making distribution endogenous in the model instead of exogenous. So I want to reiterate a few caveats about the results that we have already mentioned. First, I would say that we should focus mostly on the qualitative findings, the signs and statistical significance, and not the precise quantitative estimates, because a lot of these estimates are at least somewhat sensitive to various aspects of the methodology that we use, things like which measure we use for the target markup, the lag length that is used, other things like this affect the results somewhat, but most of the qualitative findings that we arrive at are pretty robust across different specifications. So we want to focus mostly on comparing the same model for the two different estimation methods between OLS and GMM to see if the OLS estimation method biases the estimates at all. Again, we mentioned this before, but we did find a structural break in unit labor costs. And so because of this, we modeled the model to include the structural break. And so we end up with two different sets of estimates before the structural break and after the structural break, specifically for unit labor costs. And then the final caveat is that, as we have mentioned, we do not address all of the criticisms of the structural estimation method. We are focusing only on a few of them, but we still note that this will not fully capture all dynamic interactions. But we do think this is nevertheless a helpful contribution to test some of the hypotheses about what might be flaws in previous studies in this methodology. right, so here we have the results for model 1, and this uses the first measure of the target markup, or proxy rather, which is the gross profit margin. And we have here results for both types of shocks, shocks to the markup, that's in the first row here, as well as shocks to unit labor costs. So I want to focus first on shocks to the markup, and we can see that in this first row here that we do find, regardless of whether we're using the OLS estimation method or systems GMM, a positive and significant effect, or a positive effect rather, of a decreasing markup. So we find an inverse relationship whereby if the markup decreases, this increases the wage share. And because this changes the wage share and also has an effect on net exports, we find that if the markup decreases, this has a positive and significant effect on private aggregate demand, or private aggregate demand. And this is true in both OLS and GMM, if we want to focus on these all effects here, or for the significant only effects. And also, strikingly, what we find is that the estimated wage-led demand effects here are bigger when we estimate the model as a system in which distribution is endogenous. So the previous criticism of studies in this area using this methodology has been that because they treat distribution as exogenous, they might be underestimating profit-led demand effects. Well, actually, we find the opposite here. And that is true both for the markup, and we will see for unit labor costs as well. So actually, our results for unit labor costs are a little bit more nuanced because we have this structural break. For our first period before 1982, before the structural break, we actually find no significant effect of unit labor costs on the wage share. And so because unit labor costs doesn't seem to have much of an effect on the wage share in this period, unit labor costs in turn don't impact consumption and investment. And so the only significant effects that we find for this time period are through net exports. And because of that, unit labor costs, if they increase, are going to make US products less competitive internationally. And so because of that, it's not that surprising that we find profit-led demand effects for this period. But again, interestingly to note, even though we do find profit-led demand effects overall in this period, the results are less profit-led when we estimate the model as a system, as opposed to single equations that treat distribution as exogenous. Now, after the structural break, we find more results that are more in line with what we expected. We find that increasing unit labor costs do increase the wage share significantly. And because of this, the total effects of an increase in unit labor costs on private demand are not significant. And the reason for that is that if unit labor costs increase, this has a negative effect on net exports, but it does have a positive effect by increasing the wage share on domestic demand. And so the overall result here is small and close to zero and insignificant because these two different effects cancel each other out, essentially. In the second model, our results are fairly similar. This is the model that uses that separate proxy for the target markup. This one is the average markup based on the micro data. Again, we see that a fall in the markup is going to have a positive effect on the wage share and a significant effect on the wage share. And we also find, at least when we estimate this model as a system using GMM, that a decrease in the markup has a positive effect on private demand. And the same pattern that we found for the first model is true here as well, that we find stronger wage-led demand effects or weaker profit-led demand effects when we are using the systems estimation method as opposed to the single equation exogenous distribution method. Looking at a rise in the unit labor cost, again, we see no significant effect on the wage share in this first period before the structural break. And so because of this, the net export effects of an increase in unit labor costs dominate, and we find profit-led effects of a rise in the unit labor costs before 1982. But these effects are weaker, they're less profit-led, using systems estimation in contrast to single equation estimation. And then after the structural break, we find that an increase in unit labor costs does increase the wage share. And because of this, the total effect of a rise in unit labor costs on private demand is insignificant, because there are some negative effects through net exports. When unit labor costs go up, domestic products are less competitive internationally, and so our net exports fall. But when unit labor costs in this period rise, this does increase the wage share, and so there are more positive effects on consumption and residential investment that cancel those things out. So this next table breaks down some of these results by the components of demand to make this a little bit clearer. So again, model 1 uses the gross profit margin measure of the markup, whereas model 2 uses the micro-based average markup rate. And we again are comparing OLS to GMM. And so we can see how the different components of aggregate demand were impacted by these two different types of shocks. This one is looking first at monopoly power. The next table that I will show shows shock to unit labor costs. So here we show that a 1 standard deviation decrease in the markup leads to a positive and significant effect on consumption in both models. And these effects are significant in both GMM systems estimation models. The results for residential investment are a little bit more mixed. We find that a decrease in monopoly power always is found to have a positive effect on residential investment, but this is only significant in one of our models. Similarly, for non-residential investment, we find that decreasing monopoly power actually reduces business investment, but none of these effects are found to be significant in any of the models. And then we find positive effects of a decrease in monopoly power on exports, but no significant effects on imports. And only those positive effects are only found in one of the models. In the other model, there's no significant effect. So again, adding all of this up, we find that across both models, there is a positive effect of a decreasing monopoly power variable on domestic demand, but also a positive effect on net exports. And so adding these two things together, we get a more positive effect on total private demand. So essentially, in both of our models, we find that decreasing monopoly power increases demand overall. And again, comparing the single estimation method, single equation estimation method to the systems estimation method, we find more wage-led effects using the system method that makes distribution endogenous and takes into account some of the interactions between the different equations. So to summarize this up a little bit more, I mentioned most of this already, so I will go through this relatively quickly. But we do find that a fall in monopoly power has a positive effect on the wage share, significant regardless of which measurement we use for monopoly power. This has a positive effect on exports, at least in one model, and not really any other significant effects on net exports, and positive effects on domestic demand as well. And so because of this, we find that decreasing monopoly power tends to increase demand. And these wage-led demand effects are stronger using the systems estimation method as opposed to the single equation. Now, looking for unit labor costs, we have two different sets of results before and after the structural break. Before the structural break, we don't find any significant domestic demand effects. So nothing for consumption or either type of investment is found to be significant between 1963 and 1981. But we do find some significant net export effects wherein increasing unit labor costs decrease exports and increase imports. So because of this, there's no significant domestic effect. Most of the effects come from net exports. And because increasing unit labor costs reduces net exports, we find that increasing unit labor costs are going to reduce demand. But again, the effects are found to be smaller using our systems GMM as opposed to the single equation OLS. After the structural break, we do find some significant domestic effects. For example, we find that increasing unit labor costs does increase the wage share, and so this leads to an increase in consumption and a significant increase in residential investment in at least one model, but positive in all models. Again, we find no significant effect on non-residential investment, although we do find the expected negative sign here. And most of the net export effects are similar before and after the structural break. So because we have these domestic effects that are positive effect of increasing unit labor costs, and these net export effects that are negative, the total effect is fairly small and insignificant in all of our models. But again, it bears repeating that our system estimation method finds less profit-led results or more wage-led results in both of the models that we estimate. And in one of the models, even it switches from profit-led to wage-led, though both are insignificant. All right, so I'm going to summarize the main conclusions of the whole paper here. Again, we think our main contribution comes from controlling for the endogeneity of distribution in this type of model, as well as looking at different sources of distributional shocks. So even though one of the main criticisms of this structural type of model has been that treating income distribution as exogenous is likely to bias the results to make them more wage-led, we actually find the opposite. We find that when we account for endogeneity and common shocks across these equations, in every one of our models that we estimated, we find that this makes demand more wage-led or less profit-led. So the direction of bias is actually the opposite of what had been predicted by some of the critics of this type of research before. We also do find that there are important differences based on the type of distributional shock that impacts the wage share. So for example, we find that reducing the degree of monopoly power always leads to wage-led demand effects. But if we increase unit labor costs to increase the wage share, these effects are a little bit more mixed, and they vary depending on the time period that we are looking at. Right, so before our structural break, we find that increasing unit labor costs reduces total demand, although not significantly the case after the structural break. Or sorry, I misspoke there. So before the structural break, increasing unit labor costs decreases demand. After the structural break, it increases demand, but these results aren't significant. So how could we explain these differences in unit labor cost results across the two different time periods? Well, our speculative answer is that before 1982, if unit labor costs increase, firms were mostly able to pass on these cost increases to customers in the form of higher prices. And so because of this, there wasn't really much of an effect of higher labor costs on the wage share itself. But after 1982, when we start to see changes to labor market institutions, we start to see more global trade. Once unit labor costs increase, this does have a distributional effect. We also do find different effects of the wage share on different types of investment, residential versus non-residential. We do find the opposite signs there that we expected, but it is important to note that most of these effects in our estimates tend to be insignificant, although there are a few exceptions. Okay, so summarizing again, I think the most important thing to take away from the paper is that there are big differences on demand depending on the source of distributional shock. And also, the main finding that we see, a big consistent pattern, is that the results tend to be more wage-led or less profit-led when we account for the systemic aspects of the model. And in particular, our model, we think, emphasizes not just these differences in residential versus non-residential effects, but also the importance of net exports in the model. Right? We saw that whether or not demand was wage-led or profit-led in our estimates was highly dependent on how big the net export effects were relative to some of the domestic effects. And we didn't really find big effects for investment at all. And so even though the theoretical model of Margolin and Baduri places a big role on investment, we think that the bigger channel that plays a role here is net exports. So before we wrap up here and open the floor for questions and comments, a few notes on the implications of this, as well as some caveats to remind you of. Right, so much of the literature, at least empirically, tries to look at whether or not a country is wage-led or profit-led. And so we think this is a little bit too simplistic. We need to think about different sources of shocks. And also, we think there are policy implications as well, because we find that reducing monopoly power can redistribute income while making the country more competitive internationally. So this might be a better policy track to follow than trying to raise unit labor costs. So I will end it there in the interest of time to save more room for questions.
Well, thanks, Michael, Robert, and Kim. Before we start with the questions of the audience, I have some comments to do on your work. My comments will be more theoretical and conceptual than econometric. So, but I think that it can be interesting for further development of your work in the future. Well, my first comment is regarding motivation. One thing that you want to do is to increase employment and to reduce income inequality. And one of the ways to do that is to lower concentration and reduce monopoly power. So my first question is how to do this? Because concentration, mainly in manufacturing industry, is a direct consequence of increasing returns. So it's a technological data. You simply cannot revert it. I remember that many years ago, there is a book called Small's Beautiful of Shoemakers or something else that defends the old Christian tradition of small firms, family firms, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting, but the reality of increasing returns in capitalism is completely different of that. So how to lower concentration or to reduce monopoly power? Liberals in Brazil, for instance, say exactly that in order to reduce the monopoly power, it's necessary to reduce trade tariffs, or in order to increase trade openness. So reduction of trade tariffs and increased trade openness could be a policy alternative to reduce monopoly power and to lower concentration. That's a question that I would like hear an answer for you. Well, so there is an empirical regularity, not only in the United States economy, but also in Europe, I guess. That is the long-run decline in wage share since more or less the middle of the 70s. The question is, what is the cause of the decline in wage share? Well, the Kalexian literature, I think that gives too much emphasis on aggregate variables. I have a different perspective on that. I think that the decline in wage share can be the result of structural changes, not only in the US economy, but also in some sense in the European economies. For instance, since the middle 70s, you have both in the United States and Europe, reducing of manufacturing share in total employment. This means that you are transferring labor from manufacturing to low-tech sectors. Well, the wage difference between manufacturing and low-tech services is very great. It's very big. So when you fire a worker on automobile industry and you hire him in McDonald's, the average wage of his worker will be much lower than was in General Motors. I think that this stem was presented on that movie American Industry last year. So first point. Second point, financialization. Marvio Davila thesis presented on Siena University, supervised by Leonello Punzo, my friend, and Selena Sordi, one of the chapters of the thesis showed that in the American economy, there is an increasing share of value added of financial activities, even in manufacturing industry. If you decompose the added value in all sectors, there is an increasing share of financial activities in all other sectors in the economy. So this can, if there is financialization in this sense that Marvin Davila defines on his PhD thesis, then it will increase the non-wage income. So if you increase the non-wage income, the result will be the reduction in wage income. But this will be related not with markups or concentration in manufacturing industry, but a financialization, right? Well, regarding my specific comments about the theoretical model, the first one, when you present the price equation, there is no imported raw materials. Why that? Why you choose that? Real exchange rate in your price equation affects only the desired level of markup, but you have no imported raw materials. And well, I remember that in the 80s, when Lance Taylor begins to build his structuralist models, he always presented the models for open economies with imported raw materials. And there is an imported channel by which nominal exchange rate devaluation had effects over inflation, income distribution, employment growth, and so on and so forth. Well, my second comment is about profits and financial income. There is no distinction in your model between profits and financial income. They are aggregated in the same variable. We have profits. So, but we know that in the real world, there is the productive capitalists and the financial capitalists, and there is an important intra-capitalist conflict. If we separate financial income from profits, then a reduction in wage share can be the result of increasing in the share of financial income, not necessarily of productive capitalists' income. So, and another issue, why you do not introduce trade tariffs in the markup equation? Because, you know, of course, US economy is a very open economy, I know that, but even in the United States, there is still trade tariffs. Well, and Trump are using that as a weapon to create manufacturing jobs in the United States. So I think that analyze the effects of changes in trade tariffs over income distribution and aggregate demand could be an interesting extension of your work. Finally, when you estimate the exports and imports equation, well, you use the standard view that considers the income elasticities of exports and imports as constants. Well, here I have to sell my story, the new developmentalist story. We think that income elasticities of exports and imports can be taken as given in the short or in the medium run, but not on the long run. The income elasticities of exports and imports depends on the productive structure of the economy, and the productive structure of the economy changes because of structural change. For instance, both in the United States and Europe, there is a lot of structural change in the last 30 years with the manufacturing industry reducing its share in employment and in GDP. And of course, that this have impacts over the income elasticities of exports and imports. Well, what governs the dynamics, the long run dynamics of income elasticity of exports and imports? Well, according to new developmentalist literature, the long run dynamics of income elasticities depends on the difference between the actual exchange rate and the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. The industrial equilibrium exchange rate is defined as the level of real exchange rate that will make domestic firms that operate with state-of-art technology competitive in both domestic and international markets with other firms in the rest of the world. So maybe if you consider the possibility of structural change where the income elasticities of exports and imports change due to, for instance, overvalued exchange rate. And I think that for the United States had for a long period of time an exchange rate overvalued. And maybe that's the only thing that Trump is correct. He always complain about that. And his complaint, well, maybe he did not have the right economic reasoning for that, but yes, he's correct about that. So that's the questions that I make for you. And I have some questions from the audience. I think that is more reasonable for people to make you first the questions, and then in the end you answer everyone else, including me. So Gabriel Porcilli is the first to ask his question. Gabriel, please.
Thank you, José Luis, and thank you, Robert and colleagues, for this wonderful presentation. I found it very interesting because I think it moves our empirical discussion forward. To some extent, this debate about wage-led and profit-led, we were in a kind of interregnum or impasse in which two different, very different results were provided, and we had no elements somehow to try to answer why these results were so different. So I believe that your work makes an important contribution to this. I have only one question, which is the following. It surprises me that the unit labor cost proved to be less significant after 1982, when precisely you have a US economy more globalized and more integrated to international trade. So it is a bit counterintuitive that given the importance that you have given to net exports, it's a bit counterintuitive that you don't have a stronger effect of a rise in unit labor costs or a fall in this period after 1982. Perhaps one answer could be that there are changes at the same time in the degree of monopoly that could somehow compensate for these changes in the unit labor cost.
Sorry, can I answer this one right away?
Okay.
Gabriel, no, I'm sorry. It's more significant. It's only significant after 1982.
It's more significant.
Yes.
Than before 1992.
Correct. It's insignificant before.
Okay, I didn't get. I get.
So we can dispense with that one. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's okay. Thank you.
There is more questions for the audience, please. Don't be shy. Leonardo Vera, please.
Well, thank you very much, José Luis, for organizing this seminar. And thank you, of course, to YK, Robert, and Michael for the presentation of very stimulating and challenging paper. First, one observation, I welcome very much, and we celebrate very much the idea that income distribution can be endogenous in neo-Keynesian models. Usually when we teach these models to undergraduates or first-year graduate students, We use, the sort of first generation model in this neo-Kalekian framework, in which basically what you say is, well, here is the markup. The markup is exogenous, and increasing the markup will increase the profit share, will decrease the wage shares, and will have some sort of an effect on aggregate demand and output. And now, well, using this Robert's idea that the market can be flexible in an open economy, and then we can endogenize the profit share and the wage share, income distribution in general, and with quite interesting results. Now, my questions are the following. How would you react to the criticisms that will come when someone says that, for instance, the differences that you have with other models in the structural approach are due to data sources or the sample size or even the time framework? And so just would like to know, how would you react to those sorts of criticisms? Second question is the following. And it's something that is very common in this empirical literature. The investment function is a headache. It's very difficult to find a relationship between income distribution and investment. But in the theoretical models, this relationship is quite important and sometimes critical. I mean, the relationship between income distribution and investment could determine whether the regime is profit-led or even wage-led. And then what I can see is that you already have, or you of course have, the same difficulty with your investment function. And just want to know, what is your reaction to that? What ideas we can apply in order to overcome this kind of problems when we try to estimate these sort of models? And the third question is a very short one. If I understand well, you're basically saying, well, the real exchange rate will be a determinant of the markup, or external competitiveness is a factor that will affect the markup. But I'm not sure if you are assuming, or I'm not sure if your underlying assumption is that the nominal exchange rate is fixed. If the nominal exchange rate is fixed, then how can you say that this is a good assumption for the US economy? But it's maybe something that I didn't understand quite well. Just I leave that question in order to understand better what you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonardo. More questions from the audience? No more? So, Robert, Michael, Kim, the audience is yours.
Okay, maybe I could start if that's okay, and then Yon and Mike can add their thoughts. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for these questions and comments, and especially José Luis for those very deep questions. I should point out that José wrote a textbook on macroeconomic theory a few years ago in Portuguese. I don't know if it has been translated into other languages yet. He sent me the chapters, and my Portuguese is very limited, so I read the chapter on open economy neo-Kaleckian models, and it was the best exposition ever. So if you ever publish that in English, we would love to see it. But I think you understand this literature deeply, and those questions reflected that. I'll just go in the order of the questions. How to reduce monopoly power? This is a very big question, and you're right that certainly increasing returns are an important part of it. And nowadays, that's not only the traditional increasing returns with high fixed costs of capital equipment, but it's also research and development, it's networking externalities, It's the way that firms like Amazon can go across industries. They're both retail and wholesale and delivery and online shopping all at once. And then they compete with Google, which does search, but it also does shopping and so forth and so on. So it is a big, big question, and I do not claim to have all the answers. But I would point out that there are a number of policies that have contributed to high profit markups and high monopoly power in the United States. And unfortunately, our government has actually promoted these policies in trade agreements. For example, NAFTA with Mexico. Hola, Ignacio. For example, patent protection, copyright law, all of the intellectual property rights, or really intellectual property protectionism, as Dean Baker would call it. And so since the 1970s, there have been increases in the time for patents. There's been more ability to patent things that were not patentable previously. Copyright has been extended. And then when countries sign trade agreements with the United States, we pressure the other countries to agree to that. And if Trump actually stopped doing that, so for his own reasons, but up until the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, under Obama, the US was pushing that. When Trump withdrew the United States from TPP, the other 11 countries happily removed some of those provisions from the agreement and then went on to have, I think, a better agreement. So there are policies, particularly this intellectual property protectionism that have been very important in that. But there's other measures that could be taken to address, for example, mergers and acquisitions. We've not had much antitrust enforcement by the Justice Department for decades now. And this is in areas like, say, retail, where we have big pharmacy chains that have sort of monopoly or oligopoly power around the country, and they buy up little local things, and then they take over and raise the markups for consumers. So it's not all the big firms. So and then there's the Amazons and the Googles and all of that. So it's a complicated picture, but I think there are at least some policies we could adopt. On the specific point about tariffs, that's a really interesting one. I happen to have been teaching international trade, the graduate course, for the first time in many years. And so, there is a new literature in the trade theory by people like Mark Mellitz and Itzholke and Redding and many others with heterogeneous firms. And in this literature, and it's a very new approach to trade theory, and just since 2003, when trade is open, tariffs are reduced, we get a paradoxical effect. Actually, profit margins can rise. And there's a very famous empirical study of this by Blecker and Warszynski. It was in American Economic Review 2012 with data from, it's hard to believe, the country of Melania Trump, Slovenia. When Slovenia became independent and joined the European Union, it made a nice test case for global opening of the market. And Blecker and Warszynski show that profit markups increased after trade liberalization. And the reason for this is it's contrary to the old-fashioned theories, but the reason is that firms are heterogeneous in their costs or productivities, and trade selects for the more productive firms. So when trade is open or tariffs are reduced, less productive firms go out of business. They exit the market. And only the more productive firms are left, but those firms have higher profits. And this could also lead to greater inequality, as proved by some German economists, Egger and Kreckemeyer. And so there's a wonderful literature there. And I think heterodox economists should pay more attention to it. But maybe your Brazilian friends should learn about this literature. I can send you the references. Financialization, there were several questions related to that and to Marlon Davila's work. I mean, I certainly agree about that. It's you know, probably too much to incorporate in this paper, given how many things we do. We did try a number of control variables for financial effects. Some of them are still in some equations for investment. Others were not significant and were taken out. But it's, you know, it's just a subject for another paper, I think. There was a really good paper applying the structural method to the US economy by Özlem Onuran and two co-authors in 2011. I think it was in the Cambridge Journal. And they separated the profits of the firms from the financial income of the rentiers. And they showed the very different effects. You know, I think that might add another level of complexity to what we're doing, but it's certainly an important avenue to pursue. About raw materials, you know, in principle, yes, they should be in the equations for prices and for the income shares. My guess is that it's less significant for the United States than for many developing countries or emerging countries. When Lance Taylor wrote those models, he was originally thinking about developing countries in his structuralist macroeconomics. Also, from an empirical point of view, it would be harder to measure that at the aggregate level. So there are easily available data on unit labor costs and the underpinnings of that. It would be hard. I mean, I'm sure we could do it, but to find a proxy for raw material costs would be, I think, more difficult, but maybe not impossible. Interestingly, of course, if the raw materials like energy, and the US does import some energy, especially historically in our sample period. So it could have an influence on the markup given the way we define the markup. So we tested for that. It's not in the paper because the results were not very robust. But we had a variable, for example, for real oil prices, an oil price shock variable. And we tried to include that in some of our equations in earlier estimates. And for econometric reasons, we ended up taking that variable out. But some of the estimates did show significant effects. Putting tariffs in the markup equation, so that's an interesting idea. And of course, now the theory on that, as I said, is more complicated than it used to be. If we could get an aggregate measure of tariffs, it would be interesting to test for that. There are, of course, as with any variable, issues of endogeneity, because the measures of tariffs that we have are realized tariff revenue collected by the government as a percentage of trade imports or percentage of GDP, and that's going to be endogenous. It would be better to have them measure the tariff rates, some kind of weighted average tariff rates. I think that's harder to get a hold of. But yeah, that is something we could try. Your suggestion about the export and import elasticities, income elasticities, of course, that grows out of your work in structuralist development economics and new developmentalism. I think that's a really great idea to see if that is true in the United States as well as Brazil. I think it would have to be a separate paper because it's just too much complication for this one. I did some work in a previous paper, back in 2007, on the overvaluation of the dollar affecting demand for investment in US manufacturing corporations, and found significant effects. So it would be really interesting to see if that has changed the income elasticities. But I think for this paper, it's, again, probably too much complexity because to do the GMM estimates, we need to limit the number of parameters we have to estimate. And so that constrained what we could do. And Leonardo's questions. Yes, the investment function is a headache empirically. I know Mike and Yun shared in those headaches as we tried many different specifications. I will just say that theoretically, I think this specification is not correct. I mean, the accelerator effect should be that the level of investment, which is the change in the capital stock, is a function of the change in output. That's the correct way to specify an accelerator effect. The only Neokoletsky model that ever did that is one of the very first, very little known, paper by the Italian economist Del Monte in 1975. And I read that one in Italian. Luckily, I can read math because it's mostly math. So again, we did it this way for comparison with the existing literature, but I think that the wage share or profit share is not the right measure of profitability to have in an investment function. That's a longer conversation, but I quite agree with you. And maybe Mike and Yun will remember more about our econometric efforts. And what are we assuming about the nominal exchange rate? Leonardo also asked about that. I guess I'd have to go back and think about it. I mean, we don't have an equation for it. We do not attempt to measure that. In effect, we treat E times PF as exogenous. So we are treating the prices of the foreign goods converted to US dollars as an exogenous variable. The implicit assumption there is not that the nominal exchange rate is constant, but rather that it is governed by other forces outside of this model. So for example, expectations, international financial markets, interest rate differentials, covered and uncovered interest arbitrage, all those things. But we don't attempt to explain that here, but it's certainly worth more thought. So thank you for all those questions, and let's see what the colleagues have to add.
I'll add a couple of things if we have time here. So first, in terms of Jose's question about what is the cause of the decline in the labor share. So that is something that we don't necessarily address too much in this paper, but I will say that I'm doing some other work on this, and all of the things that you mentioned are things that are key components of that model. So for example, financialization and declining manufacturing sector employment are two really big components. Other things like globalization, technological change play a role in that. And I think really what my paper argues is that all of these things reduce the labor share primarily because they restrict labor bargaining power. So there are probably other things that play into this too, more institutional and policy related things that cut back on labor bargaining power, specific things related to unionization rules and so on. But certainly those comments resonated there because a lot of what you were talking about has a lot of empirical support, at least in the US case, from my experience there. A couple other things in terms of what Gabriel was saying about the unit labor costs, I just wanted to clarify a little bit here as well, because it is true that we did find more significant results after the structural break, but I think you were maybe talking about the total effect, which we found was insignificant after the structural break. But the reason for that wasn't anything particularly related to trade. It was mostly just because there were more domestic effects that were significant in the later period, and the net export effects were pretty similar before and after the break. And then the final thing, Leonardo asked a question about how we would react to the criticism that perhaps some of our differences from other research here is due to difference in data or things like that. I will say that this paper focuses on an original model, but we also in some early stages of this research did something resembling a replication of two previous studies, one by Stockhammer and Wildauer, one by Oneron and Galanis. And the data wasn't exactly the same, but for the most part, the data here is pretty similar to what's been used in the literature, excluding some of the novel aspects of the model, like decomposing investment and things like that. So I don't think data differences play a big role, but I do think some of the modeling choices that we make explain our differences from the previous structural studies here primarily. And I will wrap up there. Yoon, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I think most of them are already addressed, but I think that one of the question that Jose made was about the financializations. I mean, it's interesting question, and it's really also about what do we mean by financializations. So if you think of a financialization as sort of the where the source of the profit is, like I think that's what Krippner, her papers, what she labeled as a accumulation view. Then I think that so it's about where the source of the profit is. So the kind of the approach that we are taking do account for that, but perhaps the way that we think about these estimates and interpretation about the result can be different from could be different depending on how we think about this financialization and where the source of the profit income is. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about how these things is manifested in this kind of data and estimations method. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Esteban Perez wants to do a couple of questions. Esteban, please.
Yes. Well, excellent paper. Thank you very much. It's been really very interesting. I just have a couple of questions. The first one is the structural break that you find in the early 1980s, and it has to do a little bit with monetary factors. Do you think that the policy implemented by the Federal Reserve of tightening the monetary policy at the end of the 1970s has anything to do with the structural break that you find starting in the 1980s? Because from my point of view, that policy had sort of medium-term, long-run effects on the economy and maybe on unit labor cost and in general disciplining labor. The other question I want to ask is regarding the issue of financialization. I mean, José Luis Oreiro mentioned financialization, but in general, there was a big transformation of finance in the 1990s and the 2000s in the financial structure. So do you think that that had anything to do with the profit share? And do you think it is worth in your model, which is basically framed in real terms, to introduce some financial variable? And the third question that I have is in terms of globalization. From what I know around the 2000s, maybe late 1990s, not only was there a transformation of finance, but there was also a relocation of production, especially in the US where firms went abroad. And I think that must have had an important effect on the profit share, even inside the United States. But it's difficult to capture that effect when you're looking at macroeconomic aggregates based basically on residence and not on nationality. That's my three questions. Thank you very much. If it's, if I'm going over time, you can answer these via email. So thank you, José Luis, for giving me the opportunity to ask these questions.
You're my guest, Stephen. Well,
I will answer start an answer unless there are other questions.
If there is any other question for Ignacio, please. Your microphone is off.
Sorry, very sorry. Yes, I just wanted to thank you, José Luis, for organizing this wonderful seminar. And of course, congratulations to all three authors for such an stimulating paper. I learned a lot today. And of course, I mean, the topic you are dealing with, it's very important. Here in Mexico, we have a debate going on this discussion, whether the economy is wage-led or profit-led and so on and so forth. So your paper contributes to this discussion. And now I'm sharing your paper with my colleagues. So I have a very simple question, very much related to what Esteban just mentioned. I wonder why you don't. Well, I didn't quite see the role of the interest rate in your model, and I think the interest rate has played a tremendous role, in particular in the sub period that you call after the break. After the structural break that happened back in the early 1980s. And I think that is a very important variable that, very many of your exogenous variables in the model are very sensitive to fluctuation of the interest rate. And to be sure, what Esteban mentioned about financialization, perhaps, you could capture in a way the effect, if not totally, at least partially, the effect of financialization, the impact on your variables, such as in particular investment. And that is, I think that is a very important thing. I mean, the role of the interest rate in a model, whether it is, whether it is a wage-led or profit-led, what is their role for the interest rate in this regard? Thank you.
I just want to complement the Ignacio question. For us Brazilians, interest rate is the big issue. You can't talk about income distribution without talking on interest rate. Luis Carlos Magalhães, that is here from IPEA at Brasilia, write a paper 2 years ago showing not only the fiscal impact, but also the impact on income distribution of changes in the short-term interest rate. That's really important to link the discussion of income distribution with interest rates, I think.
Okay, well, first of all, to Esteban and Ignacio, hola y muchísimas gracias por estas preguntas excelentes. I'm actually going to start with, so I had one thought that I forgot earlier, but I think it's really quite relevant. Something José Luis said is very important. In the Neo-Kaleckian literature, I think, and this is a self-criticism as much as anything else, we have tended to focus too much on aggregate distribution, the average markup, and we have forgotten about industrial structure and competitive or market structure. And in this respect, we have not been faithful to Kalecki or to Steindl, because Kalecki was not just a macroeconomist. He blended the micro and macro levels. His theory of degree of monopoly was rooted in an analysis of oligopolistic competition, something that he worked on his whole life. I think he was never quite satisfied, but he kept working on that. He published papers that are little known, but in the 1930s on the probability distribution, the density function that governs the size distribution of firms. And that was something that Steindl also worked on. And of course, Steindl's book in 1952 on maturity and stagnation in American capitalism was all about a theory, a kind of an evolutionary model of a capitalist economy that goes through phases of more competition and then absolute concentration and then monopoly capitalism, which has different behavior in these different time periods. And my own work on the open economy was always inspired by that, in the sense that I saw the external sector as a kind of what Steindl, I think, called a competitive fringe that could affect the oligopolistic firms. But at any rate, I think this is something we need to bring back into the Neo-Kaleckian literature. There are some efforts. I know that Mark Satterfield and some co-authors have worked on agent-based models where they take populations of firms and see how they evolve. And in fact, they get more monopolistic. But this should really be recombined at the theoretical level. And it certainly also relates to changes in industrial structure and composition, as José Luis suggested, and it may relate to real exchange rate overvaluation, as he also suggested. So I think those are really excellent points, and I wanted to mention that. On what Esteban said, yes, I totally agree. I think the change in Federal Reserve policy under Volcker in the period 1979 to 82 or 83 was a crucial, led to long-term changes in the US economy, even though those particular monetary policies were later abandoned. But when the interest rates were sent skyrocketing to 18 or 20%, we had the biggest recession since the Great Depression at the time in 1982. We had tremendous unemployment up to around 10%. And to make a long story short, it broke the back of the labor unions. And then that was coupled with Reagan breaking the strike of the air traffic controllers. And then the shift to financialization in firms, which meant that firms were now so emphasizing the interests of stockholders and their, what's it called, the shareholder value, that they were pushed to repress labor even more and to do the offshoring. I mean, there was an interesting example early in Trump's term. I don't know if anybody remembers this, just about 4 years ago, he went to Indiana, where a manufacturer of air conditioners and heaters, Carrier, was about to move jobs to Mexico. And supposedly Trump saved the jobs. Actually, that never happened. The jobs left anyway. But the interesting question is, why were the jobs leaving? Was the production in Indiana, home state of Mike Pence, was it unprofitable? No. Carrier was making plenty of profits in its operations in Indiana. So why did they move to Mexico for lower labor costs? Because the financial markets demanded even higher profits. They wanted to raise the stock value of the company that was I forget the name, the parent company of Carrier wanted to raise its stock value. And so to impress the shareholders, they made this move to lower labor costs. And unfortunately, that led many union workers to vote for Trump, and he never really did anything but make noise and tariffs and trade wars that didn't work. But anyway, Esteban, you're absolutely right. That was a crucial factor. And then the whole shift of monetary policy to a much more inflation targeting perspective, even though that's not official in the US, but that's de facto what they did, the kind of flattening of the Phillips curve, which is now horizontal. I think all of that has weakened labor very much. And, you know, now this didn't all happen at once. So did some of this happen more in the 90s, like you were suggesting, and not in the early 80s? Were there additional structural breaks? That, you know, that would be a question we would have to research. And then I will, Ignacio, the role of the interest rate. So it's one of many variables we tested for that are not in the final version of the paper because they were statistically insignificant. So we tested, I know we tested interest rate effects in the non-residential investment equation. Did we also test them in residential investment?
Yes.
And they were insignificant. So they got dropped. And you know, it may be that the rates are not so significant, but the policy, the way the Fed makes policy is significant, I think, in the way Esteban is suggesting. But it probably requires a different methodology to identify that. And lastly, I would just mention, if you look in the appendix to the paper, I don't want to take everybody's time now, at the econometric equations, you will see that a number of the variables that have been suggested here are included in various equations. So we have indicators of consumer and business debt in some of the equations for residential investment and non-residential investment. We have the manufacturing share is actually in the equation for non-residential investment. We tested it in other equations, but we ended up taking it out of there. But there is a measure of union bargaining power strike activity of labor unions in the equation for unit labor costs. And there is a variable that measures overhead labor. I'm forgetting, I think maybe it was Leonardo, somebody mentioned the role of like overhead labor, non-production workers. There's a variable that reflects that too, at least in some of the estimates for model 2. So some of these things are in the model empirically, but maybe not emphasized as much as they should be. And I'll stop there.
Anyone else? Michael, Kim, do you want to make some other comments?
So yeah, I mean, just adding to what Robert says, responding to Esteban's question about this transformation of the financial system around the 1990s. So yes, the story is not emphasized. Perhaps there could be a different dimension that we can incorporate the financial variables, but in a way, it is part of the model incorporated in the sense that if you look at the US case, you saw the data. There is a long-term declining trend of the labor share, but that decline was very sharp around the 2000s. Now, the transformation, how do you think about transformation of the financial system? If you think about that in terms of how they dealt with the household sector, then what we have seen in the US is that we have seen the steady accumulation of the household debt, but there was a very sharp increase of the household debt around the same time, or starting around like 2000, late 1990s. And we have looked at many different equations in terms of the investment, non-residential and residential investment incorporating these household debts. It is in there because we have a net worth, household net worth, as a explanatory variable, as a regressor. Now that story is not really emphasized, spelled out. It's not part of the main story that we are emphasizing, but in a way, which is important part. That's important part, right? In a way, it is that story, that dimension is incorporated into our model.
So, there is any other comments or questions? Well, folks, many thanks for the webinar. Many thanks for Robert Blecker, Michael, and Kim to have accepted our invitation from the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group and the Graduate Program in Political Economy of the University of Brasilia to this webinar. Many thanks to the people that is now with us, up to now with us in this webinar. Maybe Giulio Guarini is in Italy. It's 10 o'clock in Italy, isn't it? Well, thanks to Leonardo Vera, Esteban Perez, Ignacio, well, the Brazilian folks, and well, the webinar is finished, and let you see you next year with another webinars of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year for you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Ciao, adios.
Adios.
Thank you.
Felices Navidades.
Thank you.